My name is Roger Harrabin. I've spent 35 years reporting for the BBC on environmental issues, including agriculture and food. It's still a fascinating agenda, probably more dynamic than all the time I've known it. We are definitely in the second agricultural revolution. And, there are so many issues. For this particular panel, we have loads of questions to ask. Each question would take a whole day's seminar or 2 days seminar. So we'll go informally along and try to keep it conversational. But obviously, we wanted to talk about increasing food demand, particularly towards protein, which is having a big impact on wildlife and on rainforests. We need to talk about regenerative agriculture. If anybody believes that it really is regenerative, that would be interesting. About precision agriculture, about biotech, gene editing, the practical and ethical issues behind all this, and also about waste along the whole food chain. I mean, there's a stack of things to talk about. We're going to have a keynote for 15 minutes. I think it'd have to be just slightly less than 15 minutes, Johan. From Johan Swinnen, Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute. That's one of his many titles, but I'll save 10 minutes by not telling you the rest of them. So, Johan, over to you. And I have placed somebody in the front row who's going to be my time monitor, because I can't see you from here. So if you're running over time, I'm going to wave. Person in the front row is going to wave to you. So she's acting as a kind of a mirror. She's not my wife or anything. I don't want you to think.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Thanks very much for inviting me here. I really look forward actually to the next 2 days. I think this is very exciting events and a lot of really, really important issues on the agenda. The topic even of this session is very broad, okay? And so we were given a couple of guiding questions to look about, so I've built my intro around that. I think the panel is really nice in the sense also very broad, very different perspectives, I think. So I'm going to touch about a couple of areas, I think, a couple of issues. And I'm sure people here will complement me with a different perspective of their own view or their own background. Let me start with some good news, okay? If you see what happened between roughly 1975 and 2015 over a 40-year period, it's a miracle, okay? So there's been an improvement of hunger in the world, a reduction of hunger, improvement of food security that's never been seen in the history of the world, okay? So hundreds of millions of people left hunger, left food insecurity through a number of things that happened in the world. So that's really quite amazing, actually, that we've been able to accomplish that. If you look over the last 10 years, okay, things are very different, actually. We have seen a major reversal in food security in the world. We're actually, I call it, it's not just a lost decade, it's actually a reverse decade. We're back to where we were roughly in 2005. And then when you look at the other indicators beyond just the hunger numbers and the acute food insecurity numbers, if we look at nutrition, for example, the numbers are much worse, okay? So we have roughly about 800 to 900 million people suffering of hunger right now. We have about 300 billion people, okay, which is really a large share of the population on the planet who cannot afford a healthy diet. About 2 billion people are suffering from micronutrient deficiencies. And at the same time, we have about 2 billion people who are now suffering from overweight, from obesity. And if you look at obesity numbers, they are not going up. I mean, not even the last decade. I mean, of the last 25 years, they're growing very significantly. They're the highest in the richest part of the world. But the biggest growth is actually in the upper, lower income and in the middle income countries. Then, of course, the environmental externalities of food production are really quite catastrophic. So agriculture is contributing to a major share of energy use in the world. It's contributing somewhere between 25 and 33%, depending on the accounted, to greenhouse gas emissions. And so we use agriculture use a lot of the fresh water resources. And of course, the impact on biodiversity is, as you all know, not good at all, okay? I mean, drivers of this turnaround, really, okay, part of it is economic. Okay, we've seen a decline in economic growth in the lower income countries. It's still the number one reason of food insecurity. conflict is a big growth. Okay, if you look at the numbers, it's really quite shocking that between, let's say, 1990 2050, we had about 40 million people in the world which were what we called displaced, involuntary displaced. If you look over the last decade, that has grown from about 40 million people to about 120 million people, so it's tripled due to a number of reasons, internal conflict, external conflicts, but it's really a very dramatic increase going forward. Then, of course, we had a number of additional shocks like COVID, the Ukraine-Russia war, and things like that. And so the impact of those have been direct in the sense that they have affected access to food, but they've also been very much indirect in the sense they've created a very unstable and a very volatile climate. If you look at food prices, let's say between the 60s and the 1990s, I mean, prices were low but fairly stable on average, okay, generally with some blips. Since then, the last 25 years have been very volatile prices and food prices in the world. And that, of course, means that resilience should be central to whatever policy framework we're going to use for the future. So the new normal is shocks. The new normal is volatility and not stability where, I mean, when you think about the price shock, it means you deviate from normality, while normality is probably going forward the fluctuations. Another point which I think is very important is basically slowdown of productivity growth in the world. That is one now we have an increase in demand for food, but with the productivity growth that we see is not picking up the same thing. And again, the last 15 years are different from the years before, where we really saw a very significant growth of what's called total factor productivity. That's economists call it. That's a growth which is not due to using more land or more water or more other resources, but actually based on knowledge and scientific evolution. Okay, and that's really slowing down. Climate change is reinforcing that. And there's also, of course, a number of structural inequities in our food system, which are reinforcing the negative implications. Think about if you look at the impact on shocks, if you look at nutrition status, for example, women are disproportionately affected, children are disproportionately affected, which also means if you want to solve it, you need to have a policy system, which addresses that very explicitly. In terms of technology and innovation going forward, there's a number of issues that come to it. I mean, the technology opportunities for the future are immense, okay? And a lot of it will be discussed here related to AI. We will be able to come up with insights into science more precisely, faster, and looking forward, develop science faster if we want to, if we can, okay? But there's a lot of things that need to be addressed. The first of all is, will it emerge, okay? Do we make the investments that are needed? Will it be used if it's emerged? There's a ton of technology available right now which is not used, okay, for a number of reasons. Farmers don't have the finance to invest in it. It's too risky. There's regulatory constraints. For example, the genetic innovations are a good example. We have the first generation of genetic innovation, like the GMO products, have been used very extensively in part of the world and not at all in other parts of the world. We now have a second generation. Issues around climate change are also affected by the same type of political polarization that is associated, I think, with genetic innovations. And then, of course, will it lead to the desired outcomes? And here the issue of equity, of just transition really comes to fore. And how can we make sure that increases in productivity and sustainability are also associated with increase in equity and a good distribution of the benefits around the world? Okay. In order to deal with that, I think we have to look at what are the innovations we're looking at. What's the policy framework here? I think the coordination of policies across nutrition, economics, environmental ministries, development, health, etc. That's much more elaborate now than it used to be, where we talk about food production was mostly agricultural ministries, right? So the coordination is important. To address all the constraints in terms of technology uptake, we have to think about bundling innovations. So innovations will not just either be developed if we don't invest in it or taken up unless we address the credit constraints, information constraints, and the risk constraints that various people face. Value chains are really important, okay? They're important because if you look at the share of consumer spending which goes to farmers, it's in the world, it's roughly 25 to 30%. rich countries, about 5%. But even in low to middle income countries, it's around 30-40%, which means that the vast majority already now is not going to farmers, but to all kinds of organization, private or public or non-governmental, that are in between. Okay, so they have to be part of the solution going forward, and that's really important. Not only a consideration, but also to designate a strategy. Consumer choices are obviously crucial. Okay, again, when we think about farmers, we say it's important, okay, but I think in this particular, if we think about food system transformation, their choices are crucial. They're affected by incentives, they're affected by culture, they're affected by government regulations. And typically what we've seen over the past is that these changes can be big, okay? You can have really big changes in consumer behavior, but often that takes time. They're often associated with generational changes. Think about smoking, for example. Okay, so that's the type of change that we're looking for. And the question is, do we have time to allow for this to happen? Finance is really important, okay? And so there's a number of ways how we can finance this transformation. Finance has to come both from the public sector and from the private sector. If we think on the public sector, we see right now that in developing countries, there's massive underinvestment in things like agriculture, R&D, institutional development, infrastructure investment, etc. In rich countries, there's a lot of spending on agricultural subsidies, but not necessarily those that are conducive for the food system transformation that we need. The issue of just and equitable transformation, I already mentioned, but it's not just a footnote. And it should be central to what we try to do. And then my very last point is on what economists call the political economy, but everybody else called the politics of the transformation. It's really about how this is possible, how we can make the choices that are needed at a regulatory level in an environment which is, I think it's always been difficult. This type of changes always are difficult to make, but particularly there are aspects related to social media, polarized political system, the geopolitical changes that we witness today, and the different stakeholders that need to be around the table that are all important to take into account. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you, Johan. As I predicted, it was a massive agenda, but it's like 10 times more than I had in mind. There was so much there. Martin, I think I just better leave it to you to decide which of those many strands you want to follow up. And then as we go through the panel, maybe people can be addressing either different strands. That's probably the best way to do it.
Right.
So
5 minutes.
Martin's director of the World Food Programme Global Office here in Berlin, I should say. This is a very eminent panel, I should say.
5 minutes?
5 minutes would be great.
Okay. I'm looking at you for waving at me. Joe, thank you for the presentation. Joe and I worked together in a thing called the Food System Summit that the Secretary General of the United Nations convened in 2021 under the assumption of our food systems being broken. And I think Joe really hammered home why this is the case. Maybe I can zoom in on that one number that you gave us, 340 million people in acute food insecurity. That sounds a bit like lingo. Acute food insecurity means you don't know where your next meal is coming from. And that is my clientele. These are the people that the World Food Programme is looking after. That is a shocking number in itself. And if I tell you that by Christmas 2019, this number was as low as 135 million people, you see how in the last basically 5 years, 6 years, a couple of things went fundamentally wrong. There was COVID, of course. COVID has caused massive distress, a loss in value worldwide that is staggering, and it still has its repercussions, particularly on least developed countries. Why is that? A big source of income for least developed countries is remittances. You got people all over Europe, the United States, all over the rich world, if I may say, working in very poor job, actually more often than not in food systems, washing dishes in restaurants, being fruit pickers, harvest hands, and so on, that suddenly stopped paying money back home. And then in the countries itself, there was the situation that you needed a lot of money to actually take COVID measures, and that led into a debt crisis of many of the developing countries that's still ongoing. Then, in addition, you had the Russian attack on Ukraine, being the 5th largest grain producer, a grain exporter, I'm correcting myself, on the planet, and that sent shockwaves through the system that are sort of becoming a bit quieter, but we still are at about 20 to 30% higher prices on the world market for staple foods than we had in 2019. Now, if you're an ordinary person in a developing country, let's say you're a doctor or you're a nurse, you're living on a state salary, then suddenly, the currency that you are receiving your salary in has lost dramatically value against the US dollar, which is, the main factor for world trade. And B, your food prices have just spiraled out of control. Let me give you Lebanon as an example. The money that would buy you 2 1-liter bottles of vegetable oil, cooking oil, 2 years ago, now buys you 1 teaspoonful of oil. So obviously, this is pushing families worldwide into poverty, into food insecurity, into, and here comes another word of lingo, negative coping strategy, which basically means you skip a meal or parents don't eat enough so that the children have enough. Third factor that we see behind these staggering numbers is increasing impact of climate change. And it is sort of as with the new developments in global, in international affairs, it is as if climate change doesn't exist anymore. There is even a kind of internal censorship that you're not supposed to speak about climate change, but believe me, the problem is very real. And while we have been saying over many years that hunger in the world is not a problem of insufficient production, indeed, we have enough food to feed 10 billion people. Today, it's a question of unfair distribution and waste and dietary preferences in the West and so on. I'm concerned that this might change. We have seen the impact on the world market if Ukraine, the 5th largest producers, goes offline overnight. Now imagine you would have 2 of the main producers facing severe climate stress and misharvests, and what that would mean to the world. Do I have a minute left? 30 seconds?
Depends how flexibly I stretch the word minute.
Okay, I do it in 30 minutes. What really is on my heart is that in some of the world's poorest countries, particularly in the African drylands, so the belt south of the Sahara Desert, there are enormous territories of land that could be used and were used for agriculture that are currently unused. And there is possibility by combining traditional knowledge and innovation to bring the land back into arable use. And I think this is one of the really out-of-prison cards that we have in a complicated situation to empower local population. That means particularly women to do agriculture the way it has been done before and ease the stress on the food systems and give people a sustainable solution out of hunger. And I stop here. Thank you for the 30 extra seconds.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that frankly alarming picture. We could stop on this, but I think probably given the list of things that I've been asked to cover, we probably shouldn't. So Heidi Kühn, founder of Roots of Peace, author and leader on food ideas, World Food Prize winner. Could you offer a few thoughts?
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with all of you and with this distinguished panel and discuss the importance of cultivating peace through agriculture. I began my humanitarian nonprofit, Roots of Peace, in 1997, when I learned as a Californian that there were 110 million landmines in 60 countries, roughly 1/3 of our planet. So I began a quest of turning mines to vines, explaining this to Napa Valley vintners who are able to cultivate their land without fear of these insidious seeds of hatred sown in the soil and soul of humanity beneath their plow. We began by taking Mijenko Grgić, who won the Paris tasting, to Croatia. In January 2000, he saw that there were 1.2 million landmines in his homeland. We came back to California, started with the private sector, raising the funds. And I can say in my lifetime, I have seen Croatia go from one of the top mined countries in the world to a top tourist destination. So peace is possible through agriculture. Moving to Afghanistan, we began our work there, again, in a country 80% contaminated by landmines, but conversely, 80% dependent upon agriculture for jobs. It was once known as the Garden of Central Asia. We began our work there, again, in 2002, and have continued our work throughout decades. We have planted over 8 million fruit trees in Afghanistan, and restoring the value chain that you referred to, demine, replant, and rebuild communities, is a business plan, a business model for peace. Once these beautiful fruits were harvested, instead of, again, due to decades of war, they were typically, when we arrived there, harvesting on burlap sacks in midday, dragging their products to market, expecting a meager profit. Through the funding, $200 million from USAID, Roots of Peace was able to build cold storage refrigeration, provide exports from Hamid Karzai International Airport. And because the buyers were afraid, of course, to come to Afghanistan, we took a very innovative approach, and we brought the traders to Gulf food for the first time. Buyers met with traditional markets that were known once upon a time as the Kabuli Wallas. Those were the fabled traders. And the beautiful pomegranates from Kandahar, the apples, apricots from Ghazni, Wardak, Logar, 70 varietals of grapes in Afghanistan were indigenous to the Shamali plains. Of course, never fermented, with due respect to the Muslim culture, but the grapevine represents the seeds we have in common as opposed to those which separate us. We took agricultural exports in 2014 from $250 million to $1.4 billion. Now, that is the economics of peace. We've been able to replicate that around the world. In Vietnam, again, that was certainly a war that defined my generation. I graduated from Berkeley in 1979. But it is astonishing to me to learn that today, nearly 50 years after the war ended on April 30th, 1975, 80% of the land in Quang Tri province remains contaminated, again, by these landmines you don't see, but the innocent footsteps of children and farmers. So this is a huge problem in our world. We, with Roots of Peace, turning mines to vines, trained tens of thousands of Vietnamese farmers to grow black pepper and export this black pepper to new markets, being sold at Morton & Bassett Spice Company on shelves in the United States. A percentage of the proceeds goes back to the farmers, and they're able to have the dignity not only to feed their families, but to educate their children. And parlaying, let's go over to Ukraine, where we have again, with the Napa Vintners, raised the funds to bring over the vintners from Mykolaiv, Ukraine. Now think about this for a moment. Since the war began, 30% of Ukraine is now riddled with landmines, UXOs, and cluster munition. Now, how are people going to repatriate when the war is over? Tell them, go back, start your farming, bring your children back home, pick the beautiful spring flowers that are about to bloom. Well, that just doesn't work for people living in war-torn lands. So we have a universal problem, an opportunity. I like looking at this. For every landmine removed creates fertile grounds for peace. Every fruit tree planted feeds future generations. And every tree planted sequesters the carbon that is going to fight the climate crisis. So this spring, we're calling forth global citizens on a spring offensive to plant peace through agriculture all over the world. And as these beautiful seeds are planted in Africa, where last year I was with 62 of the bravest African women deminers with MAG, the Mines Advisory Group out of Ukraine. We went out there on International Women's Day, suited up. They asked us our blood type. We went out there and detonated a mine because we wanted to show the world that peace is possible through agriculture. And in Africa, with the World Agroforestry Center, we're training the farmers to grow what's called African orphan crops. It's kind of a funny name, but it means the highly nutritional crops that are going to feed the children who are stunted in their growth beneath when they're younger than 5 years old, and not only when they're stunted, they're not able to learn as they should in school. So thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and Californian peace is possible through agriculture.
Thank you very much. What an incredibly inspiring story. I remember many years ago in Cambodia, I went to report on the theft of ancient monuments, and I went to one ancient monument where the week before I got there, a small girl had gone out in the morning collecting honey, and she had trodden on a mine, and the mine had been deliberately put there by the villagers to stop people stealing the monuments. That's a dreadful story. Anyway, thank you for that inspiration. I hope you raise lots of money here. There's a lot of rich people around, I think. So put your hands in that. Put your hands in those pockets. Right, we're going to hear now from Melissa Robledo, director and co-producer of Food Inc. and Food Inc. 2. And again, I leave it to you to choose your topic.
Sure. Again, great to be here. Honored to be part of this panel. Thank you. We made Food Inc. back in 2008. It was an opportunity to kind of lift the veil for consumers to understand where their food came from. It was a time when I think in the United States, people weren't quite thinking so much about where their food comes from. And there had been an interest in revisiting the film, and we resisted the idea until COVID happened. And what we saw at that time in the United States was some of our most vulnerable workers being sent to work in the midst of this pandemic. And in particular, we saw meatpacking workers sent to the line, and under the impression that we actually needed more meat at that time, which was not the case. And it felt like a moment when collectively Americans could relate to the dangers of going to work that people don't often think about for meatpacking workers. So ultimately, we decided to revisit this film, and the real driving focus of this sequel is the increase in consolidation among corporations from across the entire food chain, and how that puts all of us at risk. It puts our workers at risk. It puts our health at risk. It puts the environment at risk. We've been we've allowed corporations to get larger and larger, and leaving, just like in many cases, two competing companies dominating an entire sector of our an entire sector of the food economy. And we're told that this will result, the argument has been that it'll be lower prices for consumers, but ultimately, when we're left with just two companies controlling that industry, they end up setting prices. And this is a real problem. We actually have the laws on the books to prevent this kind of corporate control. And we had a real active administration fighting mergers, for instance. We saw Kroger wanting to merge with and become the largest supermarket chain, which would raise prices. We see currently in the United States, we have avian flu problem. There's egg prices are skyrocketing. In fact, there's actually enough eggs. The companies are taking the opportunity to raise prices in the face of this. So my hope is that this administration will continue the work to enforce the antitrust laws that we have on the books, to return, to diversify the all the sectors of the food economy. And as you were saying, the returning that will allow us to return to more localized economies, something we also saw that was essential during COVID. It was not a supply problem, it was a distribution problem. And so when we have distribution controlled by one company, or that the smaller farmers don't have access to participate in that system.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Alice Ravenscroft from the Good Food Institute, which is a global non-profit. And again, you choose your own topic, Alice.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure and honour to be here along with my fellow panellists. So I work with the Good Food Institute. I'll very briefly introduce the organisation. So we're a global non-profit. We work around the world trying to build a more sustainable, just and secure food system by diversifying protein production. So I'm going to talk a little bit about animal agriculture and also alternative proteins. So animal agriculture is responsible for approximately 20% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, we're seeing demand for meat increasing globally. It's set to double by 2050. There are also numerous issues around food security and health associated with animal agriculture. So it's inherently not a particularly efficient way of making food. So it takes around 9 calories of feed to make 1 calorie of chicken meat. We know that animal agriculture uses up around 83% of the farmland globally, while providing 18% of the calories to the global population. There are also issues around the emergence of zoonotic diseases. So there was an interesting report from the UNEP that was looking at preventing the next pandemic, and was basically highlighting the different drivers of the emergence of zoonotic diseases. And the first driver that it mentioned was the increasing demand for animal protein. And the second was the intensification of agriculture, in particular livestock farming. So that all sounds quite negative and worrying, but I really want to focus on a solution here, which is alternative proteins. So alternative proteins include plant-based foods, fermentation, cultivated meat, and these technologies can basically make the meat that people want to eat, but with up to 92% fewer emissions. And we know that the things that in a lot of cases are driving people's day-to-day food choices, that are kind of the non-negotiables, are taste, price, and convenience. So people have good intentions about wanting to eat in a way that helps the planet, and those 3 things are non-negotiables. So basically, this means that we need to develop alternatives for people that are delicious and affordable.
Can I ask you a quick question? Is there a tension between the need to go to man-made meat, if you like, and also the desire to avoid ultra-processed food? Is there a tension there?
So I think ultra-processed food, it's an interesting question. One thing that I would say is actually a lot of the meat that we currently consume is very processed. And I think also when you talk about processed food, there are a lot of foods that you don't consider as being processed. So things like bread, for example. So food processing is everywhere in our food system. And I think the question that's really interesting is like, what is the impact on health? And I think when you look at, for example, how does plant-based meat compare with red meat and processed meat, for example, there are randomized control trials that are showing that actually it can help to reduce the risk of things like heart disease, bowel cancer, obesity, and also improving gut health.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. We're now going to hear, last but not least, from Julius Strauss, an associate at the Food Lab here in Berlin. And I think you're going to talk to us about investment in ag.
Yeah, I'm a part of the investment team at Food Labs. We're an early stage venture capital fund investing along the entire value chain of food and agriculture. If I mean early stage, for us, that means usually coming in as the first institutional investor. So we spend a lot of time looking into all of the problems that we have now discussed, but at the same time, also talk to a lot of brilliant minds out there who are trying to tackle those problems. So I think as a last panelist, I'd try to give a somewhat hopeful outlook on what kind of solutions there are out there being developed to tackle all of those problems. Looking at the current system, I think it has somewhat successfully managed to feed humanity, to also feed a growing population, but it is under a lot of stress, which means that I think there's principally thinking two ways to approach this problem and to also take the stress of the current system. One is improving the system that's already in place, or the second approach would be to sort of rethink it from first principles. When we talk about improving the current system, I think there's a lot of exciting technologies that are being developed at the moment. We could talk about gene editing, making crops more resistant to problems like drought, or also different kinds of pests and diseases. We have livestock farming and aquaculture, where there are being new ways developed to, for example, reduce the use of antibiotics, to also tackle the problem of antimicrobial resistance. There is the whole topic of regenerative agriculture, which means that you try to make the underlying processes within agriculture more sustainable, to no longer fully rely on monocultures, to use cover crops, to in the end also promote soil health again, because in the end our soils are depleting, which is a huge problem at the moment. There's less and less nutrients in our food, but there are ways to tackle this problem. So I think looking at the current systems, there's so many different ways in which you can improve it. And then at the same time, as we already just learned now, there's also more and more novel technologies being developed. For example, when we look at alternative proteins, you just mentioned plant-based food, fermentation, cell cultivation. I think in public perception, people oftentimes are sort of afraid of those new technologies, of modifying genes to in the end grow proteins. But for example, or if we take the example of fermentation, fermentation is one of the most well-known and also historically used methods to produce food. If we look at beer, for example, what is beer? Beer is in the end a process of fermentation. And you can take, for example, mycelium, which are so the roots of fungi, and ferment them and get plant-based alternatives that taste more or less exactly the same as chicken. So I think there's so many new ways as well that are being developed to produce proteins, which then in turn also can take stress off the existing traditional agricultural field. One topic that I personally, for example, find quite interesting is that 95% of the calories that we consume on a daily basis come from around 30 crops. But at the same time, we have around 20,000 more species out there that could or have historically been consumed. But looking at sort of the system and industry that has developed over time are no longer being consumed. So I think there's also new ways of, for example, domesticating those crops again to then, for example, work with plants that are nitrogen fixating. So you need to use less fertilizer to make the whole system itself more sustainable.
Thank you very much. That's an optimistic note to end on. We have got, by some miracle, at least 1 minute left. So I'm tempted to just go along the panel and just try to, I mean, some of these talks have been pretty damn gloomy, frankly. And as I'm rather gloomy about it anyway, that's just added to my sense of gloom.
Well, I think almost all the points that we see as challenges also have opportunities, right? For example, the fact that agriculture is like or the food system more broadly and land use, particularly agriculture, is contributing between 25 and 33% of greenhouse gas solutions, means also that if we can solve it, right, then you can remove those 25% to 33%, and actually agriculture has a capacity to actually absorb things, which is very different from energy and things. And so there, I think, taking a broad perspective, I think this value chain perspective, I think the points which was made by Melissa in terms of this extreme concentrations, I think they're very, very valuable, whatever. On the other hand, if you can use the size of the intermediate system in order for good reasons, I think that's also makes it much more powerful, because one of the problems with agriculture is the fragmented nature compared to the really large scale problems there. And so making this work, using the size and the concentration, if you want, not excessive concentration, in order to basically to bring them together, I think that has big opportunities.
Okay, thank you, Martin.
If you consider that about more than half of the Earth's arable land is moderately to severely degraded, then this is alarming, but it's an enormous opportunity, because all of this land can be brought back into arable use. To do that, you don't need some high-tech invention. It can help, but mostly it's traditional and labor-intensive agriculture. Now, we have learned in our system that labor-intensive equals bad. But in countries in which you literally have millions of young people desperately looking for livelihoods, it's maybe not bad news. The magic trick is we need to give these people a little bit of recognition for the environmental services they are providing, namely carbon sequestration, but also biodiversity, providing healthy food, maintaining forgotten crops, making sure that biodiversity is there. So if we understand that, and as Joe said, we maybe have the key in our hands to fix 30% of the climate crisis.
Okay, thank you. Heidi.
Yeah, I'm quite optimistic. I see the glass of water half full rather than half empty. There's 8 billion people in the world today. In 25 years, there'll be 10 billion. And I think it's through collaboration, not competition, that we're being forced to do in this world today, that we can plant trees on this planet, fruit trees that will feed the future and sequester the carbon that's going to solve the climate crisis. It's doable. We just need to do it together in Berlin.
Okay. Melissa?
I'll just say that farmers are very resilient and they change and adapt. And in the United States, we have, I think, 75% of our land is going towards protein, the meat industry. So a shift away from that and giving farmers the tools and the market to do that could be very, just like you said, not a tech solution. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, and in the UK, meat eating is diminishing of its own accord, which is good. Alice.
So I am an optimist working on a solution to some of the issues that we've been talking about. So alternative proteins can meet the growing demand that we have for meat while creating 92% fewer emissions, using 90% less land, using less water, with far fewer of the health issues, public health issues that we have in animal agriculture. And what we need in order to unlock that potential is public funding, so funding from governments into research and development, and also the scale-up commercialization and infrastructure in order to support that sector to deliver on its potential.
Thank you, Julius.
I fully agree with what Martin just said, as in I think it is a great opportunity as well. And what makes me most optimistic, I think, is that I see on a daily basis that some of the brightest minds out there are trying to tackle this problem and they're intrinsically motivated. And I think we have the toolkit in our hands, those new technologies to tackle it. And the combination of having the toolkit and also the most motivated and smartest people out there tackling the problem is what makes me optimistic.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. That's the end of the panel. I mean, it's been remarkably interesting. So many topics that I'd like to take up, and just been biting my tongue, which is unusual for me. So far too much information. But great that you've been here to deliver it. And please, members of the audience, feel free to come and chat afterwards. And thank you, panel, and thank you, audience, for coming.